Hello and welcome to this edition of Africa This Week, your wrap of what happened across the continent. I'm Mashudu Masuta. The 4th annual BRICS summit got underway in New Delhi this week. Emerging market nations will look at ways of pressuring the West to redress global economic imbalances amid growing frustration at the pace of change in institutions such as the IMF. We spoke to Dr. Sven Grimm, Director at the Center of Chinese Studies at Stellenbosch University, for more insight on the BRICS summit.
It's definitely a meeting where I wouldn't expect very specific results to come from.
Looking at it, I mean, let's go into some of the rationale as to why that bar is being set low from your end.
It is very much a summit culture, so I think we shouldn't overburden 5 heads of state sitting together with a very, very detailed plan of action that they should come up with. Either that work has been done beforehand, and you do have a work plan that you sign off on and that you agree on little last details that you have to change, or you will have a very general statement. And in the last summits, from what I have seen, it was rather a general statement, intentions, areas that you want to take forward. It is pushing the right buttons in the statements, but in terms of what you do with it, that really happens on the ground, and that won't happen at summits. So my expectation isn't in a negative way. I just try to manage my expectations to not be disappointed afterwards.
Sven, you did say that in your report, in a comment that you wrote, you were saying that if the BRICS want to become more meaningful, they should establish mechanisms that go beyond the fireplace talks and get working groups together on issues. Just tell us a little bit more about what you would like them to see that would come up with concrete issues and for them to move forward as a body.
I think what we see at the moment with the BRICS is very much a summit culture as we've seen in the G7, G8. That is harshly criticized within the G7 and G8 as a big media event, meaningless in terms of substance, and there should be more in terms of substance from those meetings. I think what the BRICS could do is move more towards what the OECD is doing. That is an international organization, and the BRICS aren't, so it's a long way. Sorry, it's a long way. But in the OECD, you would see comparative studies, for instance, on the education sector. You would see comparative studies on how economic growth is happening and what the banking sector looks like. And these areas and comparisons between countries, and if you want a peer review between countries, would very likely be adding substance and adding bigger debates in sectors and policy areas in specific fields on what you can improve, what needs to be improved in countries, and actually do what the BRICS want to be doing, which is mutual learning.
What do you see being the biggest challenge in actually hindering progress down this avenue, Sven? Is it just a matter of this being a new entity and a new body that's still getting its workings underway, or do you read more into it?
Well, it's definitely a new body, and we should be managing, as I say, managing the expectations. But I think there's also more profound tensions within the BRICS. I am not so certain how much transparency Russia or China want on certain issues. I do see very different views on certain policy areas within the BRICS, which to some degree is natural, to some degree that is what you have in the G7 as well. But it might be a bit more pronounced given the structure of the grouping.
Africa's growth potential will continue to confound the hardest Afro-pessimists, but companies planning expansion into the continent will need a reliable business toolkit. Hendrik Malan, Operations Director for Africa at Frost & Sullivan, discussed his latest growth report.
If you take a look at all the major metrics with regards to economic development, Africa has made massive strides in the last 10 years. I think whether it be economic growth, whether it be monetary policy, regulatory reforms, everything is definitely moving forward. I think we are missing a trick, and where there is still a very big weakness as Africa, that is inter-regional trade. The skill of using each other and supporting on each other to develop the continent. I mean, we're currently, I think, at about 13% interregional trade versus Asia Pacific, which is at 39, and Eastern Europe, which is at 31. So skills-wise, we are gearing up, and I think overall, the continent is definitely gearing up to take advantage of some of the opportunity. But we still have a way to go.
Yeah, I've certainly seen figures suggesting that that intra-regional trade between African states actually stands below 10%. So I suppose those figures will vary from time to time. But in terms of getting that intra-regional trade going on, where do you see the impetus to try and get that growing coming from?
Look, I think a lot of it is really around trying to get these trade unions and these custom unions effective. You know, we have, I think, over a dozen of them active in Africa, but they're not very effective because, I mean, you know, they have great difficulty practically, you know, applying some of the policies and the measures that they put in place in the first place. You know, if we talk to some of our clients around, you know, expansion into Africa and cross-border trade, I mean, they cite the typical issues. You know, it's logistics, it's tariffs that are quite high, bureaucracy, crime, and those things should be sorted out. You know, those things are addressable things that we can sort out, you know, at the regional level. Southern Africa is not doing too bad with the SADC. Eastern Africa, I think, is doing well as well, but the West and the North has quite a long way to go still.
Yeah, so people speak about this huge opportunity, but I suppose the bigger question for someone, let's say, who's sitting outside the continent, maybe say in Beijing or in Washington or wherever they could be, would be this opportunity that we see now. Just how sustainable is it, particularly given the volatility we know that swirls around African politics and economies and general regulation?
I think we're definitely seeing a new Africa story developing over the last 10 years. I think a lot of the growth in the past has been based on resources. And the extractive industries are not very sustainable when it comes to growth. We're seeing a lot more diversification in economies in general. And like I said earlier, I think if you take a look at all the major indicators, for Africa in particular, the continent is really moving forward in a very big way. Particular examples around financing is increasing. We deal a lot with private equity, corporate finance, and structured finance. And I think in the last 15 or 20 meetings I've had, only 2 companies said that they don't have an approach or a strategy for Africa, and they don't have plans of expanding into Africa. So I think a lot of the fundamental problems that we face are being addressed, and are being addressed at a much quicker rate than we've seen in the 80s and the 90s.
So if you're advising, say, an investor who's sitting somewhere in Accra and looking at us now and watching the show and thinking, so what would be the major risks to investing onto the continent? What sort of key challenges would you identify for a would-be investor?
How long is your show? Look, I think apart from the usual suspects, around things like logistics and finance, I think a big challenge for a lot of companies is really the diversity of the continent. We've got 54 countries, we've got 1,500 languages, God knows how many religions. The diversity on the continent is a very big thing and a very difficult thing for companies in general to address. Africa is often viewed as a continent when it comes to market entry, but really, the 54 countries is what you want to take a look at individually. Other factors would be things like, the sheer size of the continent. I saw a picture the other day where they grouped the US, Europe, India, China, Argentina, and New Zealand into the landmass of Africa. Other things that we typically come up with as well as time frame. It's very difficult to determine return on investment in Africa due to the longer time frames it typically takes to take advantage of addressable markets. So even though you've identified particular opportunities, taking advantage of those opportunities takes longer because of the operational challenges we face on the ground, which makes your calculations around return on investment quite difficult. I can mention quite a number more, but those are some of the main ones, apart from the usual suspects, as I said.
No, sure. You spoke earlier on about a new Africa. What defines this new Africa? And give us perhaps some examples of where this is.
Look, I think for the first time, we're definitely very confident that Africa is starting to cement its place in the global economy. One of the most positive things we found is that the trade with the BRICS countries, so i.e. the economic engines of the world, is increasing, and increasing drastically as well. I think we're currently at around 20% trade-wise with BRICS countries, and that figure is expected to move up to about 50% by the year 2030. And what is good about the line with some of the BRIC countries is they've got a tendency of sticking around. A lot of the investment and a lot of the interest from the West is still arm's length, still through third parties. Where the BRICS countries are actually investing in manufacturing. They've been investing in infrastructure, and they're taking advantage of some of the local entrepreneurial opportunities as well. I'd like to see some of the statistics around the number of Chinese nationals 10 years ago versus now, but it's substantial.
Emerging economies have to be given a fair shot at leading the institutions at the heart of global finance, or they will end up going their own way. This according to Africa's challenger for the top job at the World Bank. Dr. Peterson, a Kocha Associate Fellow at the African Institute for Applied Economics, gave us a Nigerian perspective on Finance Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala's candidature.
Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has a chance. At least we are in the era of gender reverberations, and you know, the IMF chief is a woman, is a lady, and it wouldn't be out of place for a lady to equally head the World Bank. However, it should be noted that the voting parts, on the bank's board depends on the financial subscriptions, attached to individual countries, and the country that has the highest, the higher financial subscription determines what happens. For instance, USA has 20%, while the 47 sub-African countries, which has 2 boards of directors, only have 7%. So, well, in that case, much politics should really get into place to make sure that she gets there. Yeah. But so in all, she has a better chance. Getting to be the World Bank.
If I get you correctly, what you're saying is that she's got the qualifications, but vote-wise, we are unlikely to be able to get her onto the World Bank presidency, because we know that the Americans who have put up a candidate have 20%. We also know that the Europeans, in order to safeguard their position on the IMF, will support the US. So realistically, should she be running, or she should perhaps just, make a statement with the nomination and then perhaps withdraw?
Yeah, much politics should really get into place. The Americans supported the Europeans during the context regarding the IMF, IMF headship. So this time, much politics should equally get into play. But as concerns qualifications, she's very, very much qualified. She's been there. She's the managing director of World Bank. But considering the percentages, 20% for US, 7% for 47 sub-African countries, the chances are slim, except if we put in more effort politically. It's not out of place trying to poach the Americans, even the Europeans, just to let her go.
Absolutely. What I've noticed about this time around, though, is that we've got Africa solidified behind one candidate and speaking with one voice, which is absolutely essential and, of course, very laudable. At the same time, though, what I haven't heard is other, emerging market economies coming up behind this emerging market candidate and saying, actually, we should be supporting you. Should we be asking difficult questions out of our emerging market counterparts about why they are not speaking about this candidature?
Well, in my view, the emerging markets, should really rally around Okonjo-Iweala, because she seemed to understand all the nitty-gritties in African countries and equally in emerging economies. So I don't see them, the aspect of now trying to divide their vote, or maybe trying to get their vote en bloc, let's say to the American, would definitely be out of place, because Okonjo-Iweala has been there. She understands the nitty-gritties, even in emerging economies, and would definitely, be beneficial to their cause.
After the break, more stories making headlines this week.